So now that we've talked about climate change and its relationship with disaster management, we have spoken how they're related, how disaster management should include climate change, we should go to what the institutional framework is on disaster management. Now, as you all know that disasters have been happening for centuries, they're not a new thing. As I mentioned earlier, man-made disasters are probably a more recent consequence of our actions, right? There are three things that we will talk about in the framework section. There is a legal framework, there is an institutional framework, and there is also an international framework. In the legal framework, before 2005, there was no single law that existed which talked about disaster management. Why is that? First of all, I believe that disaster management is not something that can be contained within one law, right? Disasters are not taken care of or handled by one authority only. And so therefore, it is difficult to define and constrict and mandate on disasters within one law. However, over time, and as I mentioned earlier, in the Bhopal gas tragedy, after which the Environment Protection Act was implemented, a lot of other laws came into practice. Slowly and steadily, we started to think about an act which would at least somehow frame what the institutional mechanism should be, right? As I said earlier, we were a more relief-centric approach was taken to disasters. We would think about what is a relief-centric approach. We would look at a disaster, we would see what has happened, how do we deal with it after the disaster has taken place. For example, if there is a cyclone, the government would look at post-disaster strategies, they would look at evacuation of people, they would look at how to give them relief, how to rescue those people, how do we bring back the infrastructure and, rehabilitating those people in that area. However, now also with the development of science and technology, we have better technology to see if there are disasters that can come up, if, there are cyclones that are going to hit the Indian coastline. And so therefore, for example, a good example is Visakhapatnam cyclone, which before the cyclone hit Visakhapatnam, there was a 24-hour warning given beforehand for people to move away from the coast, which is a brilliant strategy because it helped save a lot of lives, it helped save a lot of property. The Indian Navy shipyard ship port is in Visakhapatnam. They moved the ships in. They took all of those measures which are required for preventive strategies, right? And so therefore, all of this has now been mandated under an act. The act is the Disaster Management Act of 2005. It's a very recent act, and therefore, what the Disaster Management Act did was that it gave an institutional setup. I will come to the institutional setup a little later after I've given you the legal framework. The Disaster Management Act also ensured that there was effective management of disasters through, like I said, an establishment of multi-tiered institutional mechanism. These multi-tiered institutions also had very demarcated and differentiated functions that were given to them. Now coming to the institutional framework. The institutional framework is the framework which defines what are the institutions, what are the bodies, what are the authorities that are going to be responsible for disaster management. First of all, at the top level or at the nodal agency for disaster management in the country is Ministry of Home Affairs. Under the Ministry of Home Affairs, there are two key bodies that work with the government, which is the Cabinet Committee on Security and the National Crisis Management Committee. What are these authorities? The National Crisis Management Committee comes into play when there is a disaster that affects more than one state. The institutional framework provides for a state management authority. I'll come to that later. But for example, there is a cyclone that hits the coast of Andhra Pradesh, that hits the coast of, Orissa together. What do we do then? Do we only ask the district disaster management authority, the state disaster management authority to take action? No. The National Crisis Management Committee also plays a part. It plays the part of coordinating, of making sure that the disaster is effectively handled by both the states, right? Below these authorities, the authorities at the top level are the National Disaster Management Authority and under that the state and the district management authorities. What does the National Disaster Management Authority do? The National Disaster Management Authority is responsible for laying down the policies, the plans, the guidelines for disaster management, and it ensures timely and effective response to disaster. They also frame guidelines which are then adapted by the states, by the districts to take care of disasters in their areas, right? The State Development Management Authority also follows the same functions. It formulates guidelines and policies for the state, and it adapts the National Disaster Management Authority's frameworks to be implemented in the state, right? Apart from these top level authorities, there are a lot of other authorities that are responsible for disaster management in the country. Some of the known ones, or the easy to guess ones, would be the armed forces, as you've seen. Again, another example would be the Visakhapatnam case, where you saw that the army came in and the navy came in and rescued a lot of people from the coastal areas. In a lot of other areas, even in the Uttarakhand floods, the army came in and took up rescue work with the Disaster Management Authority. There is also the National Disaster Response Force, which is the NDRF, which only comes in when there is a disaster in a particular area, right? It is a force under the Government of India, and it functions as a response team to a disaster. Apart from this, there is also a National Institute of Disaster Management. What does the institute do? The institute is majorly involved in the research, in the capacity building, in the making sure that there is scientific knowledge about disasters. It is also involved with other bodies, other scientific bodies, for example, the Earth Sciences Department or other departments which can give you early signs of a disaster, right? So this is the institutional framework. Now I will talk to you about the National Disaster Management Policy of 2016, a very recent policy. But before I do that, I will tell you a little more about the international framework. So in the international framework now, there is the Sendai framework, there is the Sustainable Development Goals, and there is also the United Nations Climate Change Conference that happened, under which the Paris Agreement is one of the most popular ones, which you must have heard of. Even the Paris Agreement talks about reducing the risks due to extreme weather conditions, due to climate change consequences, right? All of these three were focused on one thing, which is disaster risk reduction, DRR, right? These are three things that were the main focal point of these three bodies, right? What happened as a result in India was that a National Disaster Management Policy of 2016 was framed. Why did we need an NDMP for 2016? The earlier one, the 2009 one, was similar, but it did not include the provisions of the Sendai framework, and therefore we needed a new policy because India is a signatory to the Sendai framework, right? It's, like I said, it's the most recent policy change in disaster management. The NDMP provides a framework and it provides a direction to the government agencies for phases of disaster management cycle. So what does a disaster management cycle look like? You will, in your module, you would have seen the framework for a disaster management cycle. So the cycle talks about the post-disaster strategies, and it also talks about preventive disaster management strategies, right? So the disaster management policy looks at certain thematic areas of action which the laws should implement, right? What are those thematic areas? The first one is understanding risk. Understanding risk of a disaster. How can that risk be handled? How can that risk be prevented? For example, if we have early warning signs of a cyclone coming in, can we in that much time evacuate all the people? If we cannot evacuate all the people, can we make sure that the loss of life and livelihood is less, right? Therefore, that thematic area is included in the policy. Secondly, interagency coordination. What does interagency coordination mean? Like I was talking to you about the crisis committee, because a disaster cannot be handled by a single agency, by a single government authority, there is need for an interagency coordination. And so therefore, when the National Disaster Management Authority frames guidelines or frames policies, it is essential that the state disaster management authority or the district disaster management authority adopts those. It's essential that the state government adopts those strategies and adopts them within their state laws, policies, or guidelines, right? The third one is that the policy mandates that we should invest in disaster risk reduction. Under this, there are two things. There is structural measures and there are non-structural measures. What are structural measures? Structural measures are measures that the government or the state governments or the district governments can put into place which help make buildings or infrastructure climate resilient, which helps us handle or face a disaster better. For example, if there is a coastline which is vulnerable to cyclones or to storms, then we make sure that no structures are put up along the coast which can be impacted due to that disaster, right? These are some structural measures that the policy mandates that the government puts into place. There are non-structural measures, which are policies, guidelines, laws that we should be framing to reduce disaster risk, right? The last thematic area is capacity building. What is capacity building? Capacity building would mean that we increase the understanding of the lay person or people who are involved in disaster management to understand what disasters are, to understand what is the risk associated with them, and also understand how do we deal with these disasters, right? Capacity building also means that the National Disaster Management Authority makes sure that there are guidelines, there are policies, there are laws that are put into place so that authorities that are working on disaster management, for example, the army or the response team that is going to work in disaster situations, are prepared for them. There is a preparedness for handling that disaster, right? We have to make sure that not only are the government bodies more informed about disasters, we have to make sure that lay person, for example, you or I, are more informed about disasters. We need to know more about, for example, if there is an earthquake, do we know how to handle a situation like an earthquake? Do we know what are the methods that we could use to save ourselves or our children or our family members, right? There should be guidelines, there should be more awareness generated about all of this, and this is what the policy focuses on. So this is what the policy mandates. Like I spoke to you, the policy is inspired by the Sendai framework, and slowly, like recently, India ratified the Paris Agreement. We are moving towards, at least institutionally and in framework, we are moving towards a more climate resilient, a more reduced risk of disasters policy framework situation, right? We are trying to handle these things better, right? So this was about the policy and the institutional framework. So I will now give you a brief summary of what we did to help you understand how the timeline went and how all of these things are related, right? I first spoke to you about what disasters are, what is disaster management. Now link the disaster management to the institutional and the legal framework. The Disaster Management Act, the Disaster Management Policy of 2016. Two important instruments that are very recent and very relevant for disaster management in the country, right? Go back to the cases that I spoke to you about. How have we gone forward with the legal framework? At the time of the Bhopal gas tragedy, India did not even have an Environment Protection Act, right? Post the Bhopal gas tragedy, the Environmental Protection Act was implemented, right? What happened after that was slowly we came to a Disaster Management Act of 2005, which mandated the setting up of the multiple tier structure, which had the national bodies, the state bodies, and the district bodies, right? All of these came together to be inspired by the international framework, which is the Sendai framework, after which we framed the National Disaster Management Policy of 2016. The National Disaster Management Policy, which with the ratification of the Paris Agreement will make sure that India goes ahead and makes more climate resilient policies, makes more laws and guidelines and frameworks which help us reduce our risk of disasters, and we have a more prompt and more responsive authority and government bodies in case disasters are felt in the country, whether natural or man.